The glass doors of the executive suite didn't just separate the rich from the poor, they separated two entirely different realities. When Julian Vance, the ruthless young CEO of Vance Dynamics, looked out his floor-to-ceiling office window, he didn't see human beings, he saw numbers on a balance sheet. So when an old, disheveled man wearing a torn jacket stepped onto the polished marble floor of the lobby holding a battered thermos, Julian didn't hesitate. Within 60 seconds, security tackled the man. Within 2 minutes, Julian personally handed him a termination notice, revoking his custodial access and throwing him into the freezing rain. What Julian didn't know was that the man's worn leather wallet contained a faded founding charter bearing the exact signature that owned the building. The morning had started like any other for Julian Vance, cold, precise, and obsessed with efficiency. Vance Dynamics was a multi-billion-dollar logistics and software giant that dominated the global supply chain market. At 34, Julian was hailed as a prodigy in corporate boardrooms across Wall Street. He was sharp, tailored in bespoke Italian suits, and notoriously unforgiving. His philosophy was simple: dead weight gets cut, regardless of history or sentiment. To Julian, sentimentality was a disease that bled profitability. Down in the lobby of Vance Dynamics headquarters, the atmosphere was vastly different. It was 7 a.m., and the city was engulfed in a severe winter storm. Rain mixed with sleet slammed against the massive glass facade. Standing quietly near the heating vent by the rear service entrance was Arthur Pendleton. To the junior executives rushing in with $5 lattes, Arthur was just an eyesore, a ragged old man who looked like he had spent the last decade living on a park bench. His coat was patched with gray duct tape, his boots were cracked, and his hands were permanently stained with engine grease and soil. Arthur held a small, dented thermos in his shivering hands, offering warm tea to the weary morning shift custodians as they clocked in. He wasn't aggressive, he spoke in a low, gentle rasp, asking simple questions about how the new automated sorting systems were performing on the lower levels. The custodians answered him with polite, weary smiles, mistaking him for a lonely night shift worker from the sanitation department down the street. At 7:15 a.m., Julian's elevator doors chimed open. Accompanied by his senior vice president, Marcus, and 2 executive assistants, Julian swept into the lobby like a force of nature. His eyes immediately caught the discrepancy. In the middle of his pristine, mirror-like marble lobby stood Arthur, taking a modest sip from his dented thermos. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. The air in the lobby instantly froze. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, razor-sharp with disdain. "Why is there a vagrant standing next to my flagship executive display? Who let him through security?" Marcus cleared his throat nervously, quickly motioning for the head of security, a heavily built man named Senior Officer Hayes. "Mr. Vance, he appears to be one of the contract maintenance workers hired for the sub-basement boiler repairs during the overnight storm." "Contract worker?" Julian stepped closer, his polished leather shoes clicking loudly against the floor. He stared down his nose at the old man, taking in the frayed collar, the stained fingers, and the calm, unbothered expression in Arthur's eyes. That calm annoyed Julian more than anything else. There was no fear in Arthur's posture, no groveling, no desperate apology. "You're a liability," Julian spat, pulling a sleek tablet from his assistant's hands and tapping the screen twice to bring up the third-party contractor portal. "Look at you. You look like a street vagrant. You lower the prestige of this firm just by standing in this room. If clients walk in and see this level of decay, it projects instability." Arthur slowly lowered his thermos. His eyes, a striking and bright hazel despite his aged face, locked onto Julian's. "Son, a building's prestige isn't built on marble floor polish. It's built on the foundations buried 30 feet under the ground, out of sight. You ought to remember that before you judge a man's coat." Julian gasped in disbelief at the audacity. "Did you just address me as son?" Julian turned to Hayes, his face flushing with cold fury. "Revoke his clearance immediately. Terminate his subcontract. Throw his gear out into the alley and escort him off this property. If he sets foot within 50 yards of this building again, have him arrested for criminal trespassing." Arthur didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply looked at Julian with an expression that wasn't anger, it was profound, haunting pity. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, faded brass key on a worn ring, and set it gently on the security console. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Vance," Arthur said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet lobby as two guards grabbed his arms. "Some debts aren't settled in cash. And some foundations can't support a tower built on vanity." Julian sneered, watching as the guards shoved the old man through the heavy glass doors into the freezing rain outside. "Clean this floor," Julian demanded to the head of maintenance, turning his back completely on the scene. "I have a board meeting in 30 minutes, and I want zero distractions." Julian rode the private glass elevator up to the 50th floor, feeling a sense of satisfaction. In his mind, he had protected the company's image. He was a man of action, a leader who purged weakness before it could spread. He walked into his corner office, poured himself a black coffee, and looked out over the skyline, completely unaware that the gears of an unstoppable catastrophe had just been set in motion. 2 hours after the old man was shoved out into the freezing storm, Julian sat at the head of the dark mahogany table in the grand boardroom. Surrounding him were 12 members of the executive board, along with representatives from the city's major investment firms. The atmosphere was charged with high-stakes tension. Vance Dynamics was on the verge of closing a $3 billion acquisition of a global shipping network, a deal that would cement Julian's position as the undisputed titan of the industry. "The numbers speak for themselves," Julian declared, tapping a remote that displayed a soaring revenue graph across the giant LED display. "We have cut operational overhead by 24% this quarter alone. By eliminating redundant personnel and streamlining our frontline staff, Vance Dynamics has achieved unprecedented profit margins." Before Julian could finish his presentation, a sharp, unscripted vibration rattled his desk console. He glanced down, mild annoyance flickering across his sharp features. It was his private line, a secure, encrypted channel reserved exclusively for emergency board communication, corporate counsel, and the bank's highest executive level. He silenced it immediately with a quick tap. 10 seconds later, the phone vibrated again. Then the landline built into the boardroom podium began to ring with a persistent, blaring pitch that drowned out Julian's voice. Julian frowned, adjusting his silk tie. "My apologies, gentlemen. Excuse me for 1 second." He stepped over to the console and picked up the receiver, keeping his tone calm and professional. "This is Julian Vance. I am currently in the middle of a high-priority investor presentation." Julian dropped the presentation and put down the clicker, a voice rasped through the speaker. It was non-executive chairman Charles Montgomery, an 70-year-old veteran financier who had funded the original expansion of Vance Dynamics 15 years ago. His voice wasn't its usual measured, authoritative drawl, it was trembling, choked with genuine panic. "Are you sitting down?" Julian felt a slight chill run up his spine, but he maintained his unyielding posture. "Charles, what is going on? The board is sitting right here waiting for me to lock in the final acquisition signatures." "The acquisition is dead, Julian," Charles shouted over the receiver, his breathing ragged. "Everything is dead if you don't fix what you just did downstairs. Where is the man from the sub-basement?" Julian stared blankly at the wall, his brow furrowing in confusion. "The sub-basement? What are you talking about? I had a homeless trespasser removed by security 2 hours ago. A third-party contract janitor who was violating dress code and threatening staff." Silence fell over the line, a heavy, suffocating silence that lasted 3 excruciating seconds. When Charles spoke again, his voice was a whisper of absolute terror. "You idiot. You absolute, arrogant idiot. That wasn't a janitor. That was Arthur Vance Pendleton." Julian's heart skipped a beat. The name echoed in his mind like a strike from a heavy bell. Pendleton. As in, the original founder. The ghost shareholder. "He isn't a ghost." Charles barked. "Arthur Pendleton built the software architecture from scratch in a garage 30 years ago. He holds 61% of the supervoting preference shares in a trust that overrides the entire board. He stepped away from public life 15 years ago after his daughter died. But he retained full legal authority to dissolve the corporate charter if the company lost its ethical mandate. He works in the lower levels in disguise once every 5 years to inspect the health of the company from the bottom up. He checks the heart of the machine, Julian." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the desk edge. That's impossible. He looked like an unhoused beggar. He was wearing duct-taped boots. He lives modestly because he donates 90% of his dividend payouts to local orphanages and homeless shelters. Charles screamed. And 10 minutes ago, Arthur's legal trust filed a formal revocation of the corporate license. They are freezing every corporate asset, pulling our master software patents, and locking down all operational servers globally at noon. Vance Dynamics isn't just taking a hit, Julian, we are being liquidated from the inside out. The entire boardroom watched in stunned silence as Julian dropped the phone. The receiver dangled from its cord, emitting a high-pitched dial tone that seemed to drill into Julian's brain. The sharp-eyed investors sitting around the table exchanged worried glances. Suddenly, the massive LED screen behind Julian flickered. The glowing green financial charts vanished, replaced by a flashing red systemic lock prompt, system revocation initiated by founder authority. Time remaining, 42 minutes. Panic rippled through the room like a shockwave. Executives scrambled to check their tablets, screens were locking down one by one, email servers were severing connections, and global distribution hubs from Tokyo to Frankfurt were pinging emergency override alarms. Julian stood frozen in the center of the room, his mind racing wildly. The man he had humiliated, the man he had called a liability and thrown out into the sleet like garbage, held his entire life, fortune, and reputation in his grease-stained hands. "Find him," Julian whispered, his voice shaking. Then he screamed at the top of his lungs, slamming his fist onto the table, "Find him now. Get every security guard, every assistant, and every camera on the streets. Do not let that man leave this district." Julian sprinted out of the boardroom, tearing off his designer tie as he reached the lobby elevator. The once immaculate glass tower was descending into absolute chaos. Alarms blared through the corridors, red emergency lights flashed along the ceilings, and hundreds of confused employees streamed toward the exits as computer terminals throughout the building went completely dark. When Julian burst into the rain-drenched street, the freezing wind struck him like a physical blow. Rain soaked through his bespoke wool suit within seconds, but he barely felt the cold. His eyes darted wildly up and down the bustling city avenues. "Arthur!" he yelled into the storm, his voice swallowed by the roaring traffic and thunder. "Arthur Pendleton." He turned to Senior Security Officer Hayes, who was frantically barking orders into his radio. "Where did he go? Which direction did he walk?" Hayes wiped rain from his eyes, his face pale with dread. "Mr. Vance, we checked the street cameras. After he left through the rear gates, he didn't call a luxury sedan or go to a private residence. He walked 4 blocks south toward the downtown municipal shelter. Julian didn't wait for a company vehicle. He broke into a full sprint down the slippery sidewalk, splashing through filthy puddles, his expensive dress shoes ruined. As he ran, his mind replayed every moment of the morning, the calm, unbothered look in Arthur's eyes, the dented thermos, the worn brass key left on the desk, and those parting words that now rang like a death sentence: "Some debts aren't settled in cash. And some foundations can't support a tower built on vanity." When Julian finally arrived at St. Jude's Community Shelter, a dilapidated brick building situated between abandoned warehouses, he pushed through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, dozens of unhoused men and women sat at long wooden tables, sipping hot soup. And sitting right in a corner, calmly spooning stew into an elderly man's bowl, was Arthur Pendleton. Julian rushed over, drenched and gasping for air. "Arthur. Mr. Pendleton. Please, stop the legal revocation. I didn't know who you were. It was a misunderstanding, a terrible, terrible mistake." Arthur didn't jump. He set his spoon down gently, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked up at Julian with those piercing hazel eyes. "A mistake, Mr. Vance. You knew exactly who I was. You saw a human being you thought had no power, no money, and no voice. And because you believed I had nothing to offer you, you treated me like dirt. I was wrong." Julian pleaded, falling to his knees beside Arthur's chair, completely unconcerned with his own dignity or the crowded room watching them. "I'll make it right. I'll double the maintenance budget. I'll put you back on the board. I'll name a foundation after you. Just cancel the shutdown order." If the patents lock at noon, Vance Dynamics goes bankrupt. Thousands of people will lose their jobs. Arthur looked down at Julian, his expression darkening with a complex mix of sadness and deep disappointment. You still think this is about money, Julian? You think you can buy your way out of a moral failure? Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn, yellowed leather notebook, tossing it onto the table between them. Open it. Julian's hands trembled as he opened the fragile notebook. Inside were hand-drawn blueprints of the company's original logistics algorithms, dated 30 years ago. But as Julian flipped through the pages, his heart froze. Page after page contained notes not just on business, but on human names, names of early factory workers, warehouse staff, and their families. And on the final page, written in faded black ink under the heading, Succession Mandate, was a statement that completely shattered Julian's understanding of his own life. In the event of my retirement, the corporate leadership shall pass to the designated heir of the Vance Family Trust, under the strict condition that he never forgets the true founder's identity, nor the sacrifice made to give him that name. Julian stared at the handwriting in sheer horror. The Vance Family Trust? My father? Arthur took a deep breath, his voice barely louder than a whisper, yet hitting Julian like a sledgehammer. Your father was my co-founder and best friend, Julian. When he died 30 years ago when you were just a boy, I didn't take his shares. I put them in a trust for you. I changed the company name to Vance Dynamics in his honor. I step into that lobby once every 5 years not to test the workers, Julian. I come to see if my best friend's son has grown into a man of honor, or a monster. Julian felt as if the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. The entire foundation of his arrogance, his pride, and his cutthroat corporate identity cracked beneath his feet. The man he had kicked out into the freezing rain wasn't just the founder of his company, he was the guardian angel who had given him his entire life. Julian sat frozen on the damp linoleum floor of the shelter, staring at the faded ink of his father's handwriting. The world around him faded into a muted blur as the full weight of the revelation hit his chest. The pristine marble tower, the multi-million-dollar salary, the cold-blooded corporate philosophy he had worn like armor, it had all been constructed on top of a sacrifice he had been completely blind to. My father. Julian choked out, his voice cracking, eyes fixed on the signature at the bottom of the page. You gave up control of the company for him? For me. Your father was a genius who believed that technology should lift humanity up, not grind it down, Arthur said, his raspy voice echoing quietly through the sheltered dining room. When he fell ill, we didn't have the capital to save him and save the company at the same time. He chose to pour every last dollar into securing the patent infrastructure so that your future would be protected. My condition for taking over was simple, I would hold the supervoting founder shares in trust until you turned 34. Today is your 34th birthday, Julian. Julian flinched as if struck. In his relentless drive for dominance, he had completely forgotten what day it was. I came into that lobby this morning to hand you the master keys to the company, Arthur continued, leaning forward, resting his weathered hands on his knees. I walked in carrying the original physical stock certificate, the one that would officially transfer 61% of the total voting power directly into your name. I came to step down permanently and let my best friend's son take his rightful place as the owner of Vance Dynamics. Arthur pulled a folded, thick parchment document from his inner coat pocket. The edges were slightly yellowed, stamped with an official state seal from 30 years ago. It was the master transfer deed. Instead of finding a leader who inherited his father's compassion and integrity, Arthur whispered, looking into Julian's eyes with profound disappointment, I found a tyrant. I watched you treat men who work 80 hours a week in your sub-basements like disposable dirt. I watched you judge a man's entire worth by the polish on his boots and the price of his suit. Julian looked at the master transfer deed, then down at his own waterlogged, mud-stained designer suit. The contrast was devastating. Arthur, please. I was blind. I thought strength meant being ruthless. I thought if I showed empathy, the board would chew me up and spit me out. Empathy isn't weakness, Julian. It's the anchor that keeps power from turning a man into a hollow shell, Arthur said firmly. Suddenly, Julian's phone blared with an agonizing, continuous alarm sound, the master override ping from the corporate mainframe. The digital clock on his screen flashed red, 11:58 a.m. Time remaining, 2 minutes until system purge. Julian's vice president, Marcus, burst through the front double doors of the shelter, panting heavily, clutching a tablet with trembling hands. Julian. Arthur. The global mainframe is 2 minutes away from executing the complete patent wipeout. Our servers in London and Tokyo are already going offline. If that countdown hits 0, Vance Dynamics ceases to exist legally. The board is dissolving, stock trading has been halted by Wall Street, and the banks are foreclosing on our operating loans right now. Marcus dropped to his knees beside Julian, holding out a digital stylus toward Arthur. Mr. Pendleton, sir. Please sign the emergency authorization stay. Override the liquidation sequence. Arthur looked from Marcus to the flashing red timer on the tablet screen, then turned his gaze back to Julian. The room fell dead silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the shelter's wall clock. The power to stop this isn't in my hands anymore, Marcus, Arthur said calmly, crossing his arms. It never was. The corporate charter states that if the trust is invoked, the company can only be restored by an act of absolute surrender from the sitting executive. Julian looked up, his face dripping with rain and sweat. Surrender? What do I have to do? Tell me what to sign. I'll give up my stock options, my executive bonus, my salary, anything. It's not about signing a document, Julian, Arthur replied softly, pointing toward the shelter's kitchen where dozens of volunteers were hard at work serving meals to the city's poorest residents. The true reveal of your father's legacy wasn't the billions in revenue. It was a clause written into the company's founding foundation charter that you never bothered to read. Arthur leaned in close, his hazel eyes locking onto Julian's soul. To stop the purge, you must publicly step down as CEO, relinquish your executive immunity, and agree to spend your next 3 years working from the absolute bottom of the company, starting as a line worker in the very sub-basement you kicked me out of today. You must rebuild this company from the dirt up, or let it burn to ashes right now. Choose. Marcus stared at Julian with terror in his eyes, clutching the digital stylus like a lifeline. Julian, sign the waiver. You can't give up the CEO position. You built your entire life for that office. Working in the sub-basement. It will ruin your reputation forever. Julian looked at the ticking clock, then turned his head to look around the crowded shelter. He saw an old woman wrapped in a frayed blanket, sharing her warm soup with a hungry child. He saw 2 former factory workers, men laid off during his last quarterly budget cuts, sitting quietly, trying to maintain their dignity despite having lost everything. Then, he looked into Arthur's eyes, seeing not an enemy or an adversary, but the loyal friend who had spent 30 years protecting a legacy Julian had almost destroyed out of pure vanity. A tear cut through the layer of grime and rain on Julian's cheek. For the first time in his adult life, the mask of the ruthless executive crumbled completely. I accept, Julian said quietly. He took the tablet from Marcus's hands. With a steady finger, he did not tap the button to preserve his salary or power. Instead, he swiped over to the corporate structure settings, accessed the master founder override, and selected voluntary demotion and executive surrender. He digitally signed his name, transferring full executive authority over Vance Dynamics back into the original founder's trust, and demoting himself to entry-level facilities maintenance. System status, restored under founder mandate. The high-pitched alarm stopped instantly. Across the room, Marcus fell back against the wall, weeping with relief as his phone lit up with messages confirming that the servers were coming back online, trading was resumed, and the company was saved. Arthur stood up slowly from his wooden chair. He walked over to Julian, who was still kneeling on the shelter floor, head bowed, waiting for his life as a billionaire to end. Instead of walking away, Arthur extended his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and stained with grease, but his grip was warm and firm. Julian looked up through red, tear-filled eyes. Arthur smiled, a warm, paternal smile that mirrored the long-lost father Julian had forgotten. Get up, son, Arthur said softly, pulling Julian up to his feet. Today, you lost a job title. But for the first time in 30 years, you found your father's heart. The heavy iron doors of the Vance Dynamics sub-basement slid open. Steam whistled through the massive heating pipes, and the roar of the automated sorting generators filled the underground facility. Standing beside a massive boiler turbine, wearing faded denim overalls, blue work boots, and gloves stained with engine grease, was Julian Vance. He wasn't staring at financial charts on an iPad. He was holding a heavy wrench, carefully calibrating the pressure valves that kept the heat running throughout the entire 50-story building above. His polished Italian leather shoes were gone. His sleek, tailored suits were replaced by a simple cloth name tag pinned over his chest, Julian, Maintenance Team. A soft footstep echoed down the concrete hallway. Julian wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm and turned to see Arthur walking toward him, wearing a dark coat and holding two dented metal thermoses. "Pressure looks good on Turbine 4, Julian said, offering a genuine, relaxed smile that had never crossed his face during his years in the executive suite. "I know," Arthur said, handing him a thermos of hot tea. "I checked the telemetry upstairs. You've reduced energy waste down here by 15%, and you did it without cutting a single worker's shift." Julian took a sip of the hot tea, leaning back against the steel workbench. "It's amazing what you noticed down here, Arthur. Up on the 50th floor, you only see people as line items on a spreadsheet. Down here, you see the hands that actually keep the building standing." Arthur smiled proudly, tapping his knuckle against Julian's shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you, Julian. Not because of the profits this company makes, but because the man standing in this sub-basement understands the true weight of a foundation." Julian looked up at the concrete ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the building far above them. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the burning need to climb to the top. He was right where he belonged, building something real from the ground up.